The heavy oak door of the Cheyenne First National Bank splintered inward with a deafening crash, showering the sunlit lobby with jagged shards of wood. For a frozen second, the murmur of commerce ceased, replaced by a stunned silence. Then came the screams. 4 men, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas, stormed the room, their pistols and shotguns driving clerks to the floor and patrons against the walls. The air, once thick with the scent of polished wood and old money, now reeked of gunpowder and fear. Josephine "Josie" Winters was thrown from her feet by the press of the panicked crowd, her worn leather satchel skittering across the marble floor. She landed hard, the air knocked from her lungs, and looked up into a maelstrom of chaos. A clerk with spectacles perched crookedly on his nose was being dragged over the teller's counter. An elderly woman sobbed into her husband's chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was only here to deposit the meager earnings from selling her mother's last few chickens, a pitiful sum that was meant to appease her stepfather for another week. A pair of polished black boots stopped inches from her face. Josie traced them upward past tailored trousers and a fine wool coat to a man who stood apart from the others. He wore no bandana. His face was a mask of chilling composure, his silver-streaked hair and trimmed beard lending him an air of distinguished authority that was grotesquely out of place. His eyes cold and gray as a winter sky surveyed the scene not with the frantic energy of a common thief, but with the detached interest of a predator observing its prey. This was the leader. "Get up, girl," he commanded, his voice a low, cultured baritone that cut through the surrounding terror. Josie scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The man's gaze swept over her, lingering for a moment on her simple faded dress before fixing on the delicate silver locket that rested against her collarbone. "That's a pretty thing," he said, his voice deceptively soft. It was her mother's. Elizabeth Winters had placed it around Josie's neck on her deathbed, her frail fingers fumbling with the clasp. "Promise me you'll stand tall, Josie," she had whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Your worth isn't measured by what men take from you, but by what you refuse to give." The locket was all she had left of that promise of her mother's love. "It was my mother's," Josie whispered, her hand instinctively flying to cover it. The man's lips twisted into a smile that held no warmth. A sentimental piece, then. The best kind. Before she could react, his hand shot out, his fingers like steel talons. He didn't just unclasp it, he ripped it from her neck. The fine chain snapped, biting into her skin. A small, sharp cry of pain escaped her lips as he held the locket up, letting it twist in the light, filtering through the dust-filled air. "Victor, we got the cash," one of the masked men shouted from the vault. The leader, Victor Holloway, barely acknowledged him. His focus was entirely on Josie, his eyes glinting with a cruel personal satisfaction. This wasn't about the locket's monetary value. It was about the act of taking it, about inflicting a wound far deeper than the broken chain had left on her skin. He slipped the locket into his waistcoat pocket, his gaze holding hers for a final terrible moment. "Consider it a down payment." He murmured the words meant for her alone. Then, with a curt nod to his men, he turned and walked calmly out of the shattered door, leaving behind a trail of terror-stolen money and a silence more profound than the one that had preceded the raid. Josie sank to her knees, her trembling hand touching the raw red line on her neck where the locket had been. The money in her satchel was forgotten. The chaos around her faded to a distant hum. All she could feel was the hollow ache in her chest, a violation that had stolen more than a piece of silver. It had stolen a memory, a promise. It had made this personal. And in the heart of that violation, a new unfamiliar feeling began to smolder, a cold, hard resolve. She didn't yet know his name, but she would never forget the face of the man who had taken the last piece of her mother. She would see him brought to justice, whatever it took. The long shadows of late afternoon stretched across the desolate prairie as Josie walked the final mile to the cabin she and her stepfather called home. The Cheyenne First National was a world away, now its terror replaced by the more familiar, grinding oppression of her daily life. The cabin slumped against the horizon, a monument to decay. Dust, fine as powdered bone, coated every surface, a constant reminder of the vast, indifferent landscape that seemed to mock her confinement. Inside, the air was stale with the ghost of last night's whiskey and the lingering scent of despair. The door, already hanging loose on one hinge, slammed open with a force that sent a shiver through the ramshackle structure. Howard Grant stumbled in his face, a bloated mask of self-pity. Years of hard drinking had softened the sharp lines of the proud cavalry officer he had once been, leaving behind a man haunted by the specter of his own failures. "Girl," he barked, his voice a gravelly slur. He swayed, catching himself on the edge of the crude wooden table. "Where have you been? Supper's not on. House is a mess." Josie placed her now empty satchel on the counter, her back to him. The sheriff had taken her statement along with everyone else's, but his weary eyes offered little hope. A man as bold and organized as the bank robber would be long gone, he'd said. Lost to the territory. "There was trouble in town," she said, her voice flat. "The bank was robbed." Howard's interest was piqued. He straightened, a flicker of avarice in his bloodshot eyes. "Robbed, did they get much?" "Everything," Josie replied, turning to face him. She kept her hand away from her neck, unwilling to show him the fresh wound. "They took everything." His face fell, the brief spark of excitement extinguished. "Just our luck. Always a step behind fortune." He slumped into a chair, reaching for the half-empty bottle that was his constant companion. "Well, no matter. Our fortunes are about to change anyway." A cold knot formed in Josie's stomach. She knew that tone. It was the one he used before a particularly disastrous card game, before wagering their last horse on the turn of a single ace. "What have you done, Howard?" "Secured our future," he declared, taking a long pull from the bottle. "We've got a guest coming. A very important guest." What kind of guest, she asked, though she already feared the answer. "The kind who holds the deeds to our lives." Howard muttered more to himself than to her. He seemed to shrink in his chair, the bluster draining out of him. "Victor Holloway. He's riding out. Wants to discuss the final terms of my debt." The name sent a jolt through her, a visceral shock of recognition. Victor Holloway. The banker. The saloon owner. The man from the bank. The man with her locket. Her breath caught in her throat. Did Howard know? Could he possibly be in league with him? No, Howard was a fool and a drunkard, but he wasn't a bank robber. This had to be a horrifying coincidence. "How much do you owe him?" she asked, her voice a strained whisper. "Enough," he snapped, his shame manifesting as anger. "Don't you look at me with your mother's judging eyes. You think I wanted this. I had a plan. I was a respected officer." "You were?" Josie said, her voice devoid of heat, which only seemed to infuriate him more. "Before you drank and gambled away every good thing my mother left us." He rose his chair, scraping against the floorboards, his hand raised as if to strike her. She didn't flinch, her gaze steady. After a moment, his arm dropped and he sagged, defeated. Just make yourself presentable. Holloway is a man of particular tastes." Josie said nothing. She moved to the stove and began preparing a meager meal of beans and stale bread, her movements stiff and mechanical. Her mind raced. Holloway was coming here. The man who had terrorized a bank, who had ripped her mother's locket from her neck, was coming to her home as a guest. The world felt tilted, its moral axis spun wildly off-center. From a distance, she saw him first. A solitary rider on the vast, empty prairie. Nathaniel Thornton, Nate. The whispers in town painted him as a recluse, a ghost who kept to his sprawling ranch downriver. They said he'd been a Union surgeon during the war, that a great tragedy had driven him from medicine and society. He rode with a straight-backed posture that spoke of a past life, a solitary, almost mythic figure against the setting sun. Josie often watched him from the cabin window, a silent observer of his solitude, finding a strange comfort in the knowledge that she wasn't the only lonely soul in this corner of Wyoming. Today his passing offered no comfort, only a stark contrast to the menace that was about to descend upon her. An hour later, the sound of approaching horses broke the evening stillness. Howard scrambled to his feet, trying to smooth his stained vest and comb his greasy hair with his fingers. Josie remained by the hearth, her arms crossed, a silent, defiant statue. Victor Holloway dismounted with the fluid grace of a man in complete control of his body and his world. He was flanked by the same brutish men from the bank, their faces now bare in the fading light. Holloway himself was dressed impeccably in a dark suit, his silver-streaked hair catching the last rays of sun. His eyes, just as cold and gray as they had been in the bank, found Josie immediately. A flicker of recognition of amusement crossed his face before he turned his attention to Howard. Grant Holloway said, his voice smooth as silk. "A pleasure to see you again. I trust you've considered my generous offer." Howard cleared his throat, attempting a dignity he did not possess. "Victor, welcome. Of course. But I may need a slight extension." Holloway's smile was a predatory slash. "Extensions are a luxury of the past, Howard. My patience and that of my partners has worn thin. The debt is due. $2,000 plus interest." He paused, his gaze drifting back to Josie. "Or the alternative we discussed." Josie felt the blood drain from her face. She finally understood. The down payment, the visit, it was all connected. Holloway wasn't just a creditor, he was a predator who had marked his prey. "The girl has nothing to do with this." Howard blustered, his voice lacking conviction. On the contrary, Holloway purred, stepping onto the porch, invading their space. "She has everything to do with it. My offer stands. You sign over the deed to this worthless scrap of land, and I forgive your debt. In exchange, Miss Winters will come to work for me. A position of hospitality at my hotel in Cheyenne." The euphemism hung in the air, thick and foul. Howard's eyes darted from Holloway to Josie, a desperate, frantic calculation in them. Josie saw the exact moment he broke the flicker of shame, extinguished by the overwhelming tide of self-preservation. "It's a fair deal," Howard mumbled, refusing to meet her eyes. No, Josie's voice was quiet, but it sliced through the tension like a shard of glass. Both men turned to look at her. "I said no." She stepped forward out of the shadows of the cabin and into the twilight, her chin held high. She looked directly at Holloway, ignoring her stepfather completely. "Whatever debt he owes it is his to pay. I am not property to be bartered." Holloway's eyebrows rose in feigned surprise, but his eyes danced with a dark, appreciative light. "Spirit. I admire that. A shame it will have to be broken." He chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "Your stepfather has already made the choice for you, my dear. The papers are already drawn up." He turned back to Howard. "See that she is ready to travel by morning. Don't make me send my men for her." With that he turned and strode back to his horse, his men falling in behind him. He mounted, gave Josie one last proprietary look, and then spurred his horse into a canter, disappearing into the growing darkness. The silence they left behind was heavier than any sound. Howard stood on the porch, his shoulders slumped, the picture of a defeated man. Josie stared out into the night, her body trembling with a rage so pure it felt like ice in her veins. "You would sell me," she said, her voice shaking. "Like a horse, like a sack of grain." "I'm trying to survive." Howard roared, his desperation finally erupting. He stormed into the cabin, grabbing the whiskey bottle. "What other choice did I have? This land is all we have left." "It's not yours to sell," Josie shot back, following him inside. "It was my mother's. It belongs to me. It belongs to the man who holds the note," he bellowed, slamming the bottle down on the table. "And that man is Victor Holloway. You will do as you're told." "I won't," she whispered, her resolve hardening into something unbreakable. "I would rather die." The words seemed to trigger something in him, a final terrible snap. Years of failure, of self-loathing, of living in the shadow of his dead wife's memory, all coalesced into a singular, violent impulse. His face, already flushed with drink, became a mask of pure fury. "Then die you shall," he screamed, his voice cracking. He lunged for her. Josie tried to back away, but he was surprisingly fast. His fingers, strong from years of ranch work, dug into her upper arms like vices. He wasn't just angry anymore, he was unhinged. She clawed at his hands, kicked at his shins, but it was like fighting a maddened bear. He dragged her out of the cabin, off the porch, and into the night. The moon had risen, casting a pale, ghostly light over the landscape. Josie screamed, but there was no one to hear her but the coyotes and the wind. He was pulling her toward the tree line, toward the low roar of the river, swollen and angry with the spring melt. "You want to defy me?" He hissed, his face inches from hers, his breath a foul wave of whiskey. "After everything I've done for you, you ungrateful little shrew." "You promised her," Josie cried, tears of terror and rage streaming down her face. "You promised my mother you would protect me." "Your mother is dead." He roared, the words a final soul-shattering betrayal. They broke through the trees. The Sweetwater River was a churning, chaotic mass of dark water and debris, its banks eroded into muddy cliffs. Howard didn't hesitate. With a final guttural cry that was equal parts rage and despair, he lifted her bodily. For a horrifying, weightless moment, she saw the cold, uncaring stars above. Then he hurled her into the freezing torrent. The shock was absolute. The icy water drove the air from her lungs in a single, violent gasp. She swallowed a mouthful of gritty water, choking, panicking. The current seized her, a powerful, indifferent monster dragging her down. Her heavy dress and boots became a leaden shroud, pulling her into the black depths. She clawed frantically, her sense of direction gone, the world a disorienting, roaring chaos. Her lungs burned, desperate for air. Light flickered tantalizingly above her, a promise of life she could no longer reach. As her strength failed, a strange calm descended. Perhaps this was it. An end to the pain, an end to the fear. Her vision began to tunnel the roar of the river, fading to a distant hum. Just as the darkness threatened to consume her completely, something broke the surface beside her. Strong arms wrapped around her waist, a force of life in the midst of death. With powerful, desperate strokes, her rescuer fought the current, pulling her head above the churning water. She gasped, coughed, and vomited river water, her lungs heaving. "I've got you," a deep voice rumbled in her ear. "Hold on." She clung to him, her fingers blindly gripping his shirt as he battled his way to the shore. He hauled her from the river's grip, and she collapsed onto the muddy bank, a shivering, wretched heap. When the worst of the coughing subsided, she looked up at her savior. In the pale moonlight, she saw the weathered face and startlingly blue eyes of the solitary rider, the recluse from downriver, Nathaniel Thornton. He knelt beside her, shrugging off his dry coat and wrapping it around her shaking shoulders. The wool was warm and smelled of wood smoke and leather. Before she could thank him, Howard Grant burst through the tree line, his face a mask of shock and fury at seeing her alive. "What in the hell is this?" he demanded, his bravado wavering under Nate's cold, steady gaze. "I believe the question," Nate said, his voice dangerously quiet as his hand moved to rest on the butt of the revolver at his hip, "is what in the hell did you just do?" Nate's ranch was a sanctuary carved out of the wilderness. The main house, built of sturdy logs, radiated a quiet warmth that belied its owner's gruff exterior. Inside, a fire crackled in the stone hearth, and bookshelves overflowed with leather-bound volumes, a silent testament to a life lived before the isolation of the frontier. While Josie recovered a fragile bond formed between her and the reclusive surgeon. It wasn't built on words. Nate was a man of profound silences, but on quiet, meaningful actions. He tended to the bruises Howard had left on her, his touch gentle and professional. He gave her his late daughter's room, a space preserved in time, and never once spoke of payment or obligation. In turn, Josie, driven by a need to prove her worth, threw herself into the rhythm of the ranch, mending clothes, tending the small vegetable garden, and discovering a surprising aptitude for Nate's disorganized account books. After a few days, when the trauma had receded enough for rational thought, they rode into Cheyenne to see Sheriff Dodge. The sheriff was a good man, as Nate had promised, but he was also a pragmatic one. He listened to Josie's story with a grim expression, his brow furrowed with concern. "I believe you, Miss Winters," he said, his voice heavy. "But Victor Holloway has deep pockets and deeper connections. He owns half this town, and the other half owes him money. An accusation of kidnapping and attempted murder against him, with only your word and Nate's against his. It's a hard case to make." "And my stepfather," Josie asked, her voice tight. "Howard's already been in spinning a tale about you being hysterical, running off in a fit. He's claiming you fell into the river by accident." The sheriff sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Without a body, and with Howard's word against yours, it's a stalemate. I can keep an eye on him, but I can't arrest him. Not yet." They left the sheriff's office with a sense of frustrated helplessness. The law, it seemed, was another one of Holloway's assets. "If the law won't help, we help ourselves." Nate said, his jaw set in a hard line as they rode out of town. "We need evidence. Something that proves what Holloway and your stepfather are truly after." Their investigation began back at Josie's old cabin. Under the pretense of collecting her remaining belongings, they searched the squalid rooms for anything that might give them leverage. It was Josie who found it tucked away in the back of Howard's dusty wardrobe, a small locked chest. Nate forced the lock with his hunting knife. Inside, beneath a stack of yellowed military commendations from a life long past, was a packet of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were from Howard's older brother, James Grant, written during the war. Most were mundane accounts of camp life, but one dated just weeks before the end of the war stood out. Josie read it aloud in the dim light of the cabin, her voice trembling slightly. "The opportunity is too great to ignore, Howard." James had written, "The entire Confederate treasury is in chaos. With the government collapsing, fortunes are being made by men bold enough to seize them. My partner, a quartermaster by the name of Mason, has devised a plan. A shipment of gold bullion meant for the final payroll can be rerouted. It is a risk, but it will secure our family's future for generations." Mason. Nate repeated the name, striking a chord deep in his memory. "He mentions no first name." "No," Josie said, scanning the page. "Just Mason." He says their share is enough to buy a dozen ranches. He calls it the price of defeat. They found nothing more. But the letter was a start. It gave a motive beyond a simple $2,000 debt, a hidden treasure. Stolen Confederate gold. It explained Holloway's relentless desire for the land. The gold had to be buried there. That evening, as they pored over Nate's meticulously kept ranch ledgers, a task Josie had taken on, with surprising zeal, Nate suddenly froze. He was staring at an old framed photograph on his mantelpiece, one Josie had dusted a dozen times without ever truly seeing. It was a formal portrait of a group of Union officers, their faces grim and proud. "What is it?" Josie asked. Nate didn't answer. He took the photograph from the mantel, his hands shaking almost imperceptibly. He pointed to a figure standing in the back row, a young dark-haired officer with a faint, arrogant smirk. "That's him. The quartermaster from the letter." I knew I recognized the name. He then pointed to another man in the photo, a captured Confederate officer being held for questioning. The man's face was older, but the cold, calculating eyes were unmistakable. "Holloway," Josie breathed. "No," Nate said, his voice a low, haunted whisper. "That's his real name. William Mason." A week later, their fragile peace was shattered. Josie was returning from the chicken coop, a basket of fresh eggs in her hand, when she saw the riders. 5 of them moving fast across the valley, dust pluming behind them. They weren't neighbors. Their movements were too direct, too predatory. She dropped the basket and ran for the house, screaming Nate's name. He met her at the door, a Winchester rifle already in his hands. Inside, bar the door. The men didn't bother with pleasantries. They fanned out surrounding the house, their rifles glinting in the afternoon sun. They weren't here to talk. A shot rang out, splintering the wood of the doorframe inches from Josie's head. She cried out, stumbling back, as Nate pushed her away from the door and returned fire through the window. The siege was brutal and efficient. They were pinned down, outmanned and outgunned. The attackers weren't just trying to intimidate them. They were trying to get inside. While 2 men laid down suppressing fire at the front of the house, the other 3 worked their way around to the back. Josie heard the sound of glass shattering in Nate's study. "They're in the study," she yelled. Nate cursed, firing 2 more shots toward the front before turning to face the new threat. "Stay here. Keep your head down." He disappeared down the short hallway. Josie huddled behind an overturned table, her heart pounding. She heard a crash, a shout, then 2 quick gunshots from the back of the house. A terrible silence followed. "Nate," she called out, her voice a raw whisper. No answer. Ignoring his order, she crept down the hallway, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The door to the study was splintered, hanging off its hinges. She peered inside. One of Holloway's men lay on the floor, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Another was slumped against the wall, clutching a wounded arm. And Nate. Nate was on his knees, his back to her, rummaging through a small wooden chest that he normally kept locked. But it wasn't Nate. As the man turned, she saw the cold, familiar eyes of Victor Holloway, William Mason. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand. Nate's old military records. "Looking for this, Captain?" Mason sneered, his voice dripping with venom. He looked past Nate, his eyes locking on Josie in the doorway. Ah, the little river rat. "Come to join the party." Nate was on the floor behind his desk, a nasty gash on his forehead, his rifle just out of reach. He was conscious, but dazed. "What do you want?" "Mason," Nate growled, pushing himself into a sitting position. "Want?" Mason laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I want what you took from me, Thornton. I want my life back. I want my brother back." He gestured with the papers. "It's all in here, isn't it? the official record. Your heroic stand. But it leaves out the best part. It leaves out the part where you let him die. Mason took a step toward Josie, his pistol leveled at Nate. But since I can't have my brother back, I'll settle for the next best thing. I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to take your land, your precious honor, and now I'm going to take her. The gold was just the bait, you old fool. The real prize has always been your ruin. The truth, when it finally came, was far more terrible than stolen gold. It was a story of fire and blood, of a promise made and a promise broken in the final chaotic days of the Civil War. After Mason and his wounded man had fled with the military records, leaving a dead body and a shattered home in their wake, Nate sat at his kitchen table while Josie cleaned the gash on his forehead. The silence was thick with unspoken questions. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades, he began to speak. William Mason wasn't just a quartermaster. Nate set his gaze distant, fixed on a memory she couldn't see. He had a younger brother, Thomas. Just a boy, really. 16. He'd lied about his age to enlist, full of romantic notions about glory. He was assigned to my field hospital as an orderly. Nate's voice grew softer. Thomas was gentle, kind. He wasn't meant for war. He sketched birds in a small notebook and wrote letters to his mother every day. William, for all his arrogance and greed, doted on the boy. He made me promise, surgeon to surgeon, he'd been a veterinarian before the war, that I would look after Thomas, that I would keep him safe behind the lines. Josie listened, her needle pausing as she stitched the wound closed. She could picture it, the idealistic boy, the protective older brother, and the weary surgeon caught between them. Then came the Battle of Five Forks, Nate continued. It was chaos. The Confederate lines were collapsing. We were overrun. Mason, who was supposed to be securing our supply lines, saw the way the wind was blowing. He and James Grant took their opportunity, loaded a wagon with the gold, and deserted their posts. They abandoned their men to die. He paused, taking a ragged breath. Their desertion left a hole in our flank. The Confederates broke through a last desperate charge. They swarmed the field hospital. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. They bayoneted the wounded in their beds. Josie's hand flew to her mouth, a horrified gasp escaping her. I tried to organize a defense. Nate said, his voice now a raw whisper. I gave my pistol to one of the walking wounded, took up a rifle myself. But it was hopeless. Among the first to fall was your stepfather's brother, James Grant. He'd come back, you see. Guilt, maybe. He tried to warn us about the gap in the line. He died trying to do the right thing, too late. His eyes finally met hers, and in their blue depths she saw pain so profound it was almost unbearable. And Thomas, Mason's brother, he was right beside me trying to help a wounded Union soldier. A Confederate cavalryman cut him down. He died in my arms, asking for his brother, asking for William. The story hung between them, a ghost in the firelight. I was the attending surgeon, Nate said, his voice cracking with a guilt that 15 years had not erased. I was the ranking officer. I was the one who promised to protect him. And I failed. After the battle, when the official reports were written, Mason twisted the story. He claimed I was the coward. That I abandoned my post, that I let his brother die to save my own skin and the lives of Union soldiers. He built a legend around his own lies. Now it all made sense. The personal nature of the robbery. The theft of the locket, an attack on something Nate had come to protect. The raid on the ranch, not for gold, but for the military records that held the official heroic account of Nate's actions, a truth Mason was desperate to erase and rewrite with his own version. The gold was never the main objective, Josie realized aloud. It was just the means to an end. It financed his new life, his power in Cheyenne. Nate affirmed. And it was the perfect tool to draw me out. He knew about Howard's connection to James Grant. He found Howard drowning in drink and debt and fed him a story about me murdering his brother and stealing a hidden treasure. He manipulated Howard into believing the gold was his birthright and that you and I were the only things standing in his way. The intricate poisonous web Mason had woven was horrifying in its complexity. His motivation wasn't greed. It was a deeply personal, twisted vendetta. He wasn't just trying to reclaim stolen treasure. He was trying to destroy the man he blamed for his brother's death, the man whose honor stood as a silent rebuke to his own cowardice. "He wants to take everything from you," Josie whispered. "Your land, your reputation, and me. He sees you as a symbol." Nate said, his hand closing over hers on the table. "Someone I've taken under my protection. By taking you, he believes he's proving I'm still the same man who failed to protect his brother. He's replaying the past with you in Thomas's place." The revelation was a cold weight in the pit of her stomach. This was no longer a fight for land or money. It was a fight for their very souls, a confrontation with a ghost from a forgotten battlefield. A ghost who would not rest until he had dragged them all down into his own personal hell. With his identity revealed and his motives laid bare, William Mason shed the pretense of the respectable banker. He became a predator, using the full weight of his influence to isolate and crush them. He went to Sheriff Dodge with a fabricated story backed by the coerced testimony of Nate's 2 captured ranch hands who were being held at an unknown location. The story was simple and damning, and the reclusive ex-surgeon Nate Thornton had gone mad murdering one of Mason's men and kidnapping his own stepdaughter Josie Winters in a dispute over land. Mason's money and power spoke louder than the sheriff's suspicions. Influential town council members, men who owed their fortunes to Holloway's bank, pressured Dodge to act. Reluctantly, with the weight of the town against him, the sheriff was forced to issue a warrant for Nate's arrest. They were no longer victims. They were fugitives. Word reached them via a young boy from a neighboring ranch, a friend of Nate's, who rode like the wind to warn them that a posse was being formed. They had minutes to escape. They packed what little they could, food, ammunition, blankets, and Nate's medical bag, and fled into the harsh, unforgiving Wyoming wilderness that bordered the ranch. The days that followed were a blur of survival. Nate, the old soldier, was in his element. He taught Josie how to read the land, how to find clean water, how to move without leaving a trail. She, in turn, proved to be a quick study. Her spirit, far from being broken, was tempered by the hardship into something resilient and strong. Their reliance on each other deepened, forged in the crucible of shared danger. They were no longer just a protector and his ward. They were partners, equals, in a desperate fight for their lives. Their greatest threat, however, came from an unexpected direction. Mason, in a stroke of cruel genius, had enlisted Howard Grant to lead the hunt. He filled Howard's head with more lies, telling him that Nate had not only murdered his brother, but had now stolen his stepdaughter and the key to the gold. Fueled by whiskey grief and Mason's poison, Howard became a relentless tracker, his knowledge of the local terrain making him a far more dangerous adversary than any hired gun. He was no longer just a pathetic drunk. He had become a physical manifestation of Mason's vendetta. One evening, as they made a cold camp in a rocky overhang, they saw his fire in the distance, closer than the night before. "He's getting better." Nate observed, his face grim in the twilight, or more desperate. "Why is he doing this?" Josie asked, her voice aching with the betrayal. "After everything, why is he helping the man who wants us dead?" "Because Mason has given him what he's always lacked." Nate set his gaze fixed on the distant fire. a purpose, a target for all his rage and regret. It's easier to hunt a monster than to look at the one in the mirror. The hunt was taking its toll. Their supplies were dwindling and the nights were growing colder. Nate's old war wounds ached with the damp, and Josie's resilience was being worn thin by constant fear and exhaustion. They knew they couldn't run forever. They needed a plan, a place to make a final stand. "We go back," Josie said suddenly, the idea forming with startling clarity. Nate looked at her, his blue eyes questioning. "Back where the ranch is being watched." "Not the ranch," she said. "My homestead. The cabin. Howard knows it, but I know it better. I know every loose floorboard, every secret nook. And Mason will want the confrontation to be there on the land where the gold is buried. It's symbolic for him." Nate considered her words, slowly nodding. "He'll expect us to keep running. He won't expect us to turn back and walk into the heart of his territory. It's a risk." "Staying out here is a risk," Josie countered. "At the cabin we can choose the ground. We can set a trap." It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only one they had. Under the cover of a moonless night, they doubled back, moving like ghosts through the land that was now a hunting ground. Their destination, the dilapidated cabin, where all the pain had begun, the place where it would have to end. The sky had turned a bruised, sickly yellow. A strange stillness had fallen over the prairie, the air thick and heavy, tasting of dust. A storm was coming. Not rain, but wind. A Wyoming dust storm, a blinding, choking gale that could strip paint from a barn and scour the land clean. It was the perfect cover. They reached the homestead as the first gusts of wind began to stir the dry soil. The cabin stood silent and empty, a forlorn silhouette against the menacing sky. Inside it was just as she'd left it, filled with the ghosts of her mother's hopes and Howard's failures. Working quickly, they prepared their trap, using Josie's intimate knowledge of the old structure. They didn't have to wait long. As the wind rose to a mournful howl, whipping dust into a thick, swirling fog that reduced visibility to mere feet, two figures emerged from the gloom. Mason and Howard. They had followed their trail to its end. "They're here," Nate said, his voice low as he peered through a crack in the boarded-up window. The final confrontation took place inside the cramped, suffocating confines of the cabin. Mason, anticipating their move, kicked the door in, using the storm's chaos as his shield. The world devolved into a whirlwind of dust, splinters, and gunfire. In the confusion, Mason got the upper hand, his pistol pressed against Josie's temple, her body a shield between him and Nate. "It ends now." Thornton Mason screamed over the roar of the wind, just like it should have ended at Five Forks. With you watching everything you care about die because you are too weak to act. He was monologuing, savoring his victory, laying out the twisted justification for his decades-long hatred. He spoke of his brother, of Nate's broken promise, painting himself as the avenger of a forgotten innocent. Nate stood helpless, his rifle lowered, his face a mask of agony. "Let her go, Mason. This is between you and me." "She is between you and me." Mason retorted, his grip tightening on Josie. "She is the price for my brother's life." It was then that the unexpected happened. Howard Grant, who had been standing back, his face a mess of confusion and drunken fear, seemed to finally see the scene for what it was: not the righteous reclamation of his family's fortune, but the deranged fantasy of a madman. He saw Mason's face contorted with insane rage, and he saw Josie's pale with terror. Something inside him, a final buried ember of decency, flickered to life. "You lied to me," Howard whispered, his voice shaking. Mason ignored him. "Goodbye, Captain." He never murdered James Howard, said his voice louder now, filled with a strange new clarity. He reached into his coat, but instead of a gun, he pulled out a folded yellowed letter. I found this in my brother's things after you left. He sent 2 letters, one for his wife and one for me. I never understood it until now. It was the secondary twist, the final piece of the puzzle. My brother wasn't a hero. Howard declared, his eyes locking with Nate's, an apology and a plea in their depths. He was a coward, just like you, Mason. This letter, it says it all. It says how you ran. It says how James came back to try and fix what you'd done. And it says Captain Thornton was the bravest man he ever knew. In a final desperate act of redemption, Howard lunged not at Nate, but at Mason. He threw himself at the man who had manipulated him, a wild sacrificial charge. The move was clumsy and slow, but it was enough. Mason, startled, shoved Josie away to deal with this new threat, firing his pistol into Howard's chest. The moment Howard's body hit the floor, Josie acted. It was the opening she had been waiting for. She scrambled toward the old hearth, her knowledge of the cabin her only weapon. She grabbed the heavy iron poker and slammed it against the crumbling chimney flue, a spot she knew was structurally weak. A cascade of soot bricks and debris rained down, creating a thick, blinding cloud in the already dust-choked room. Mason, disoriented and choking, fired blindly into the cloud. Nate used the diversion to tackle him, and the 2 men crashed to the floor. The final standoff was not one of bullets, but a raw, brutal hand-to-hand struggle. It was a fight 15 years in the making, a battle for the soul of a memory fought in the ruins of a broken home, as a dust storm raged outside. As they wrestled for the gun, Josie made her critical decision. She kicked over the heavy oak table, its thick legs trapping Mason's arm beneath its weight. His pistol clattered across the floor. Nate, free and clear, delivered a single precise blow that rendered Mason unconscious. The wind died down as suddenly as it had risen. In the eerie calm that followed, the dust began to settle, revealing the scene of devastation inside the cabin. Mason lay unconscious, his wrist broken beneath the overturned table. Howard Grant was sprawled near the door, his life bleeding out onto the dirt floor. Josie rushed to his side, ignoring the man who had tried to kill her, and saw only the man who in his final moments had tried to save her. She knelt, taking his hand. His eyes fluttered open, finding hers in the dim light. Josie. He rasped, a bloody froth on his lips. He pressed the crumpled letter into her hand. The truth. Tell them. The truth. I will, she promised, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the grime and dust. A faint, rattling sigh escaped his lips. A sliver of peace seemed to settle on his tormented features, and then he was still. He had died not as a villain, but as a man seeking a final, desperate redemption. Moments later, the door creaked open, and Sheriff Dodge and his posse stepped inside, their guns drawn, their faces grim. They had followed the trail through the storm, arriving just as the fight had ended. They took in the scene. Mason captured, Howard dead. Nate and Josie bruised but alive, with a quiet understanding. They found the Confederate gold buried beneath the old oak tree, its metallic gleam obscene in the soft light of the storm-washed afternoon. As the deputies unearthed the heavy wooden chests, Josie made a decision. She walked over to Sheriff Dodge, her back straight, her voice clear and strong. Sheriff, she said, handing him the letter Howard had given her, that gold is blood money. It destroyed my stepfather. It fueled a madman's revenge, and it nearly got us all killed. She looked from the gold to the cabin, to the body of the man who had raised her. It has caused enough pain. I want no part of it. It belongs to the federal authorities. Let them do with it what they will. The act was decisive, a clear and powerful rejection of the greed that had torn her family apart. In ceding the treasure, Josie wasn't giving up a fortune. She was claiming her soul. Nate watched her, his face battered and bleeding, but his eyes filled with a profound and unmistakable pride. His name was cleared by the contents of the letter. Mason's powerful conspirators in Cheyenne would be exposed. But in that moment, the only victory that mattered was the one he saw in the quiet strength of the young woman standing before him. Months passed. The harsh Wyoming winter gave way to a vibrant spring. The land once scoured by the dust storm was now awash in green and dotted with wildflowers, a testament to nature's resilience and its capacity for rebirth. Life on Nate's ranch had found a new peaceful rhythm. The bunkhouse was repaired, new ranch hands had been hired, and the valley was once again a sanctuary of quiet solitude. Josie had made the ranch her home. She was no longer a guest or a dependent, but an equal partner. She managed the accounts with a skill that impressed even Nate, brought a warmth to the log house it hadn't known in 15 years, and found a deep, abiding peace in the simple, honest work of the land. The ghosts of her past were fading, replaced by the promise of a future she was building with her own 2 hands. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Nate turned to her. He said nothing, but handed her a small, newly carved wooden box. It was made of cedar, and the lid was inlaid with a simple carving of a meadowlark. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, was the silver locket. The chain, once broken, had been painstakingly repaired. The sheriff had recovered it from Mason's possessions and returned it to Nate weeks ago. He had been waiting for the right moment. "I'm not a young man," Josie, Nate said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I can't give you the life a young woman might dream of. But I can offer you this: a home, a partnership, a life of peace." Tears welled in her eyes as she lifted the locket, its silver cool against her skin. She looked from the locket to Nate's weathered, honest face and saw not an old man, but the man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. As if on cue, the mail rider, a rare visitor to their secluded valley, trotted up the lane. He handed Nate a single envelope before tipping his hat and continuing on his way. The letter was addressed to Josie, the postmark from Denver. It was from her aunt. She opened it, her heart beating a little faster. It was an official invitation filled with loving words and promises of a comfortable life in the bustling city. A life of society, of culture, of eligible young men, and a future free from the harshness of the frontier. It was the life her mother might have wanted for her. Josie read the letter through, once a soft smile playing on her lips. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the wooden box beside the locket. She closed the lid with a gentle final click. She was choosing, not the life her mother had dreamed of, but the one she had earned. A life of quiet dignity, of shared burdens and simple joys. She looked up at Nate, her choice reflected clear and bright in her hazel eyes. "I think," she said, her voice full of a peace that resonated deep in her soul, "I am already home."